Thank you so much for joining us today for Using Data to Strengthen Your High-Dosage Tutoring Program, Lessons from a Rhode Island District. At this time, I would like to introduce Dr. Jessica Bailey, who will be moderating today's webinar.
Thank you so much, Shanna, and welcome everyone. I really am happy to have you all here to hear about our webinar on using data to strengthen your high-dosage tutoring program, Lessons from a Rhode Island District. For today's agenda, after some quick introductions, we'll present the evidence-based principles for effective tutoring. Next, we'll discuss how the REL team collaborated with the district in Rhode Island to use evidence and data to improve multiple tutoring programs. Then we'll hear from a principal on her perspective on the research and learnings from this experience. We'll end with ample time for questions and answers and formally conclude with a survey on today's webinar. So a little bit about who we are. The Regional Educational Laboratories, or RELs, as we like to call them, are funded by the U.S. Department of Education's Institute of Education Sciences. There are 10 labs serving the United States and territories. REL Northeast and Islands serves all of the Northeast states and Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands. We work in partnership with educators and policymakers to develop and use research that improves academic outcomes for students. We conduct research studies. We disseminate the findings and strategically engage with our partners to use the findings. And then we design and deliver technical assistance focused on the use of data and research, which is much like the project that you're going to hear about today. So for today's objectives, we want you to gain an understanding of the guiding principles for effective implementation of high-dosage tutoring programs. We want you to gain an increased understanding of program progress monitoring and data use. And we also want you to increase your knowledge of resources to support data analysis and interpretation. And in fact, we have some materials that you'll be able to download as part of this presentation. They're in the pod on the left called Download Today's Slides and some other tools there. We also want you to gain an understanding of how a principal used data to strengthen high-dosage tutoring programs. Let me just introduce the presenters that you'll hear from today. I'm Dr. Jessica Bailey. I'm a research scientist representing REL Northeast and Islands. I'm joined by my colleague, Diana Wogan, a project director with the REL. In this work, we partnered with Christina Claiborne and her colleagues at the Annenberg Institute at Brown University. And there she is the director of the Rhode Island Research to Practice Network. We also partnered with high school principal Susan Craven of Tiverton Public Schools. And to learn more about all of us, we've provided short bios in the chat. So now I'm going to hand it over to my colleague, Diana Wogan, to Christina Claiborne from Annenberg Institute to discuss the evidence-based principles for effective tutoring, which stem from Annenberg Institute's research brief on high-dosage tutoring, which we're going to provide the link in the chat for that as well. So Christina.
Great. Thank you so much, Jess. As Jess said, for the past year and a half or so, I've been steeped in research to create overviews of what we know and then pull out common themes of effective programs to create design principles to help inform recovery strategies. And we synthesized the evidence from all sorts of programs and interventions and found that intensive, individualized tutoring is likely the most effective education intervention. So because of that, there's been a surge of interest in tutoring as an approach to address unfinished learning in the wake of the pandemic, really around the world, and people are really excited about its potential. So to start us off, I have a quote from my colleague, Matt Kraft, who I work with at Brown, but more importantly, he's been evaluating tutoring programs intensively for a number of years, and he's been a strong advocate for bringing tutoring to scale across the country. He says, I'd be hard-pressed to find another intervention that has as wide and as rigorous a body of evidence for improving student performance in both math and reading than we have for tutoring. Now, the wrench in all of this is that not all tutoring is effective, and previous attempts at scaling tutoring have led to decreases in quality sometimes and little benefits for students. Further, access to tutoring service remains inherently unequal often. So tutoring can mean different things to different people, and we want to make sure that when we're talking about tutoring, we are getting away from after-school homework help with volunteers and them focusing on remedial skills or content unrelated to what students are learning in their classrooms at the moment. And we move towards students getting small group tutoring in a specific subject, tutoring sessions consistently happening a few times a week, having trained effective tutors, and having sustained relationships with a tutor so that students are not only benefiting from the academics, but also having another adult in their life who they've developed a relationship with or who can advocate for them, and someone who's a role model. And this is the type of tutoring that seems to accelerate student learning, and I'll talk about that more in detail about what we know in a few minutes. But with that in mind, let's look at what we know about the credible evidence for the effectiveness of tutoring programs and what the studies have found. In this graph, you'll see we've seen across multiple independent meta-analyses of the causal research literature that tutoring is one of the most effective academic interventions, providing an average of more than 4 months of additional learning in elementary literacy and almost 10 months of additional learning in high school math. So you can see that in those orange. And this graph shows the additional learning compared to other interventions, in this case, technology support, smaller class sizes, curricula, professional development. And we'll talk a little bit about the costs later, but this graph does not take into account costs. And so it's been a challenge to think about, the benefits to students versus the costs and the trade-offs there. There are also many reasons to be optimistic that tutoring would have benefits beyond academics. So creating positive, caring relationships with tutors might support students' social emotional development, enhance their attachment to school, expose the students to older peers who can serve as mentors for successfully navigating the education system. Now, while we can say that certain programs are effective, we can't necessarily say which part of the tutoring program, directly led to student learning. We need a bit more research for that. But the most effective programs to date tend to share some qualities, so we think that these are the likely drivers of success. The first is frequency. Students are not sporadically receiving tutoring. The most successful tutoring programs typically meet 3 to 5 times a week for at least 30 minutes per session. For personnel, unsurprisingly, teachers can make pretty good tutors because have the skills to deliver the content. But the evidence shows that there is a wide variety of tutors that can be effective if they have the right training on the content and how to effectively deliver the content. Prioritizing tutor training through a combination of ongoing professional development, peer learning communities, and on-the-job feedback is extremely important and supports the continual improvement of the tutors and the program itself. On measurement, we have found that programs that have informal assessment sort of built in and progress monitoring allows the tutors in the program to target instruction, but also allows program leaders to see what is working in their program and their context and adjust based on what they are seeing. As far as curriculum, when tutors use the proven curricular materials that are selected by the states and districts to support their students' success in the grade level content, they are much more effective than doing one-off tutoring sessions that aren't aligned to a high-quality curriculum or what the students are doing in their day-to-day classwork. For delivery mode, most research has been on in-person since a lot of this was done pre-pandemic, but there is evidence that virtual can be effective and it's worth pursuing, definitely. On group size, effective tutoring programs have low student-to-tutor ratios. generally no higher than 4-to-1, preferably 2-to-1 or 1-on-1 to make it easier for tutors to personalize the instruction. Larger student-to-tutor ratios require that tutors have a much broader set of pedagogical skills than those necessary for individualized instruction. But as you might expect, too, student-to-tutor ratios pose a trade-off between individualization and cost-effectiveness. On focus, we often get asked in which grades and subjects tutoring is most effective. And the answer is that programs have been studied much more in the early grades and much more in reading over math, but there is evidence that tutoring is effective in all subjects and all grades. On relationships, giving students an opportunity to connect on a deeper level with the same tutor multiple times a week, which I mentioned a bit earlier, might not only accelerate their learning, but also provide a key social connection, which could be a key driver to success here. And the shift to virtual learning last year highlighted how critical relationships are to student motivation and well-being. On scheduling, we found that incorporating tutoring into the school day promotes regular attendance, also better coordination with teachers, and a stronger academic culture. Tutoring that occurs before or after school is less effective on average, mainly because it's harder to ensure transportation with students, conflicts with other after-school things, and attendance is lower. However, you'll see later in this webinar, Susan Craven at Tiverton School District in Rhode Island had a lot of success in implementing an after-school tutoring program. So just because the literature has found that it's less effective on average doesn't mean that it can't work in certain contexts. On prioritization, it would be great if we could do tutoring for all students. That would foster a collective commitment to supporting the program because it'd be seen as a core practice rather than this ancillary program. But sometimes that is not feasible given the money that is available. So most programs that have been studied have targeted students who perform below a certain threshold. So whether it be on an exam or given their grades or some other threshold that the school has decided is important, or those students who are in transitional grades. So maybe moving from 8th to 9th grade, and they would like to have a little bit more support to support that high school transition. Just this last note is that the study programs under these design principles have largely been efficacy trials. So those are those types of studies where they are somewhat smaller, designed with all the best advantages that a program might be able to offer in a small setting and people who are very willing to participate. So there are open questions about what this would look like and what's possible at scale and what the trade-offs are across contexts. And it's a bit of a balancing act, right? But fidelity to the core components of a program and providing flexibility for practitioners to shape the implementation within their context. So with that, the design principles here are only an initial framework. There will certainly be some bumps in the road, I think, and these principles should be revised and amended based on lessons learned from just piloting new programs and results from ongoing evaluations and building a networked system for sharing best practices, which the rest of our conversation and getting into the details of how exactly we do this and how we learn from what we're doing. So with that, I'll hand it over to Diana to talk about using evidence and data to monitor progress and to improve tutoring programs.
Thanks so much, Christina. So yes, now we're going to talk more about how we actually use evidence and data to improve tutoring programs in Tiverton, Rhode Island. So as Christina said, it's important for your tutoring program to be driven by data. There's a lot of evidence about the importance of using data to improve student outcomes that I'm sure we're all familiar with. And at the same time, we know from the research on data use that practitioners often need support in effectively using data. Luckily, there are several approaches to effectively using data. So one approach is using a structured data inquiry process to help practitioners make data-based decisions to improve student outcomes. And another approach is the continuous improvement model, which incorporates data use while also aiming to make program improvements. So I'll talk about each of these approaches, both of which we used in our work with Tiverton, Rhode Island schools. So you're likely all familiar with a data inquiry process, such as the one shown on the slide here. This illustrates 5 steps in the process, which begins with seeking information to answer a particular question you might have, such as, how well is our tutoring program working towards meeting its goals? The next step is accessing and gathering the data, preferably from multiple sources. Next, you analyze and interpret that data, looking for patterns, drawing inferences, and then you act upon those results. So how can you act on the data to improve outcomes? Or are there changes you can make to your tutoring program? Finally, you evaluate the actions taken to assess whether they've addressed the original question, and then the cycle continues. So that's the data inquiry process. A similar but slightly different process is the continuous improvement cycle. So continuous improvement processes engage key players, including educators, to focus on a really specific problem of practice, and then go through a series of iterative cycles to test different change practices, gather data about those change practices, and then study whether they've had any influence on outcomes of interest, which could be things like student attendance or math performance. And these iterative cycles, or plan, do, study, act cycles, PDSAs, are a central focus of continuous improvement efforts. And so we used elements of continuous improvement in our work with Rhode Island schools. And I see that Emily just posted a link in the chat to a toolkit that REL Northeastern Islands recently published about continuous improvement. And this is meant to be a toolkit that you could use if you want to try out continuous improvement in your school or district. Includes a lot of tools and resources to help you do that. So our approach working with Tiverton School District was a combination of both continuous improvement and data inquiry. So we worked with school leaders to help them plan and seek information and gather data. And part of our planning was to articulate goals through a theory of action, which I'll talk about in a minute. Planning also included making decisions about what data to collect and determining a data collection process and timeline. We studied the data. So we analyzed and interpreted the data with the school leaders. And then to act on the data, we helped them think through what kind of program adjustments they might want to make. And then I think an important part was helping them think about how to communicate the progress to tutors and others involved in the program. And then we went through the cycle again. So we looked at data 2 or 3 times over the course of a 5 or so week tutoring program. We also created several tools along the way, which I'll show you next. So most of these tools are available in the download pod, so you can open them up, download them, use them, and hopefully they'll be helpful for you. So we, in collaboration with Christina and her colleagues at the Annenberg Center, created a series of tools to monitor progress of the tutoring program and help make improvements. So these included attendance tracking spreadsheets, and these were helpful because having one spreadsheet that each tutor could use helped them to capture attendance in the same way so that it could be analyzed easily. We also used perception surveys for students and tutors to gather information about their perception of the program. We had a data collection and review schedule, which was really helpful keeping track of all the different pieces and the timeline, especially in shorter programs, so that we made sure we had the data available to look at when we needed it. We also have templates that we use to help display the data so that we could use the same type of information each time we looked at the data. This was helpful to identify change over time and helpful in making the data really accessible so that we can then sit down and study it and reflect on it. And we also created a list of best practices for data collection. So as I said, most of these are available in the download pod. Please go ahead and download them and access those. And we also used a theory of action template in a data-driven dialogue, which I'll show you next. So before you start using data to improve your programs, it's important to articulate a theory of action. And sometimes people call this a theory of change. I think they could be used interchangeably. But why have a theory of action? So it's really a useful tool that can help drive your program or policy. It's something that helps provide a big picture to look at, which can help get people on the same page so everyone has the same understanding of the program and where you're trying to get to. So a theory of action really states your rationale for your particular program or policy and why you think that it will be effective in achieving your goals. And as I talked about both of the approaches to using data, they both referenced goals. So you have to talk about, if we're going to be using data effectively, you have to have some established goals in place that you can reference. So the theory of action can just be a sentence or two. Essentially, if we do X, it will lead to Y. So in our work with Sue, we spent some time talking through and articulating a theory of action. And this is what Tiverton's theory of action looked like. Didn't take too long to articulate this. You know, it was something that Sue was clearly already thinking about and had in mind, but maybe just didn't have down on paper in this format. So we just helped do that. And it was something that we referred to in our subsequent conversations when we were actually looking at data and reflecting on the progress of the programs. So Tiverton's theory of action is that if we provide 2 hours of tutoring in targeted subjects per week for small groups of students, then students will be more engaged in school, and students' academic performance and course grades will improve, and then students will graduate on time or be ready for 9th grade. And you can see that last box has 2 outcomes because this applied to 2 different programs for students in different grade levels. We also used a condensed version of a data-driven dialogue protocol, which is a really useful tool as you're actually looking at data. So different from the whole data inquiry process, this protocol is just when you're in that step where you're looking at the data. So we use this tool in our work with Tiverton once we had our data to examine. And what I think is an important takeaway here, you'll see this version includes the steps of making observations and inferences from the data. And I think it's really important to start by just making your observations before jumping to your inferences so that you understand the data that you're looking at. It can be really easy to jump right into saying, oh, this is the problem, or this is what worked, or these are my inferences. So that's a little bit about our process and what we did with Susan, our colleague in Tiverton. We have time for some questions and answers, both for myself and for Christina. If there are any, I'll check out the chat. Like some of the questions were already answered. Jess, are there any other questions in the chat that Christina or I should answer?
I can speak to the question on scheduling. I can go for that one. So really good question there. The findings on scheduling hold up even with a lot of the other optimal design principles. I don't think it's been tested where you can pull out that one specific thing and hold everything else equal, but it's more so that the issue seems to be with attendance. So even if the tutoring program is well designed, you know, it won't provide the intended benefit if students have logistical things that limit their ability to come outside of school hours. But like I said, Susan and team at Tiverton found a lot of success, and I think she can speak to it a little bit later. But I think what they did was targeted outreach to students to incentivize them to come and create conditions that make it easier for them to make it to the tutoring sessions, thereby promoting attendance and seeing a successful tutoring program with a lot of the other optimal design principles, but after school, which we've seen is not super effective elsewhere.
Great, thanks so much, Christina. And it looks like there's another question about the student surveys that you all created. and whether or not we could share those. Do you want to address that, Christina?
Oh, yeah. We worked with, so there's another side of the house essentially at the Annenberg Institute at Brown called the National Student Support Accelerator, and they are doing amazing work on tutoring and developing tools for districts trying to either create their own tutoring programs or partner with other organizations to create tutoring programs. So we can drop the link to that in the chat if that makes sense. But we worked with our colleagues there to create the student surveys. We can certainly share those. There are also very similar questions on the National Student Support Accelerator website that are questions that overview the kinds of things that you would want to know from the students. Are they attending? Are they enjoying the sessions? Do they feel like they are doing better with their academics? Like, do they feel more confident about it? Do they feel like they're creating relationships? Things like that. So all of those on the website can be modified for your specific context as well.
Thank you,
Great,
Christina.
thanks so much.
And thanks, Diana. Looks like we had a lot of people who lost audio through the speakers, and so we're going to have just a quick restart. And if you just hang on a moment, we are just going to address this. Actually, would you just mind repeating your answer, Christina, about the survey piece, just so for those folks who did not hear during that time, and then we'll get moving.
Sure. I said something along the lines of, we are working with the National Student Support Accelerator, which is another program working with the Annenberg Institute. And they are putting together many, many materials for districts who are either creating their own tutoring programs or working with a provider to implement a tutoring program. And one of the things that they have created, and then we sort of worked with them to adapt it to our context and with Tiverton, are these student surveys. And so I can put a link in the chat both to the overall website, but also to the student surveys. They provide some examples of questions that will get to things like, are students feeling better about their academic ability? Do they feel better about like the math that they are doing? Do they feel better relationships with their tutors? Do they feel like they are being encouraged to come to classes? Things like that you wouldn't necessarily get from the quantitative data or the things that you see from their academic exams. So I will put a link to the chat, and those are available online to alter based on your context. And I think we can also just share the ones that we used with Tiverton. I will check with Jess on that. Oh, thank you, Kathy. You put it in the chat there.
Great. Thanks, Christina, and thanks, Kathy. So yeah, that surveys are now accessible in the link in the chat. And we have our other resources in the download pod. So thanks so much for your questions. So now I want to transition over to Jessica, who is going to introduce Susan, who you've referenced a bunch, the principal of the high school in Tiverton that we've worked with, and excited to hear the practitioner perspective.
All right. Thank you, Diana, and thank you, Christina. So now I'd like for all of you to hear some of the lessons learned from a practitioner perspective. So we're fortunate to have high school principal Susan Craven here today to talk with us. Excuse me. And for this session, I'll pose questions to Susan and have her respond. But if you have questions that you're curious about, please just put them in the chat and we'll get back to them during a Q&A session that we'll have before we conclude. Okay, so Susan, can you first just tell us a little bit about what the tutoring programs were that you implemented back in the spring and summer of this year, and then talk about what principles from the Ed Research for Recovery brief on high-dosage tutoring were most relevant for your program's implementation?
Sure, no problem. Thank you for having me, and I really appreciate the work that you've done with Tiverton because it has definitely helped us incredibly. Just going to start sharing. So in the spring of last year, we started our high-dosage tutoring program, essentially working with 8th graders who were transitioning to 9th grade and who were struggling due to distance learning. And that was in the core content areas of ELA and mathematics. And then during the summer at the middle school and high school, we implemented 4 more programs, 2 at the middle school for those transition years, students coming from grade 4 to go into grade 5, and 1 from students in grade 8 going into grade 9. And at the high school level, we had a credit recovery class, which was helpful for those students who were in danger of not graduating on time. And we also implemented at the high school level an elective class to help students who were having a difficult time getting back into the swing of being in school, and we helped them to develop those skills that they needed to be successful as well.
Great. And what principles that Christina covered, of those 10 principles from the research brief, did you find most important and relevant for your programs?
Yeah, I feel like the most important ones were, first and foremost, class size, right? We really needed to stick with that number 4 or below that. And thinking about the relationship piece, it was very important as well. When you have a small group of students, you can develop better relationships with them. And that design principle helped us to do that too. And the measurement of how we were doing, very important. And so with your assistance, we were able to focus on that cycle of continuous improvement that you spoke about. And examining the data, those quick formative assessments throughout, getting feedback from the students was key.
That's great to hear. Wonderful. Okay. So the next question I have for you is, what's been the biggest benefit of utilizing this program progress monitoring and continuous improvement process during implementation that you just alluded to?
The survey data definitely helped in making adjustments to our practice, right? And you think about how feedback is critical to success, and sometimes the feedback we give to our students isn't as helpful as the feedback our students give to us, right? And so examples of adjustments that we made during the process, we're looking at the attendance data, and if there were students who we know weren't attending, we were able to call them in and say, what's going on? And, the attendance data was helpful. Looking at the survey that the students gave us to make adjustments to the program. For example, our 5th graders were looking at having movement breaks during their sessions and having a snack break. And so we made those adjustments so that they could be successful. Decisions that were made at that level were helpful for the teachers as well, so we can get the feedback from the students and let the teachers know whether or not the curriculum was an obstacle. And just all of those survey results were influencing what we did and how we did it as we rolled out our programs.
That's great to hear. And just from working with you on that, I remember looking at the data and seeing some really small suggestions that were really easy to implement, providing more movement breaks, providing more snacks, providing more of that interaction time for the students to interact and go outside. Those were all pieces of feedback that you got from the student surveys that was really nice to see. And then also some of the feedback that we saw was really validating the work that you were doing. So it wasn't about just making improvements, but it was about knowing that you're on the right track too. So that was really great to see. Okay, another question that I have for you then are, what are some lessons that you learned that you think others might be able to benefit from knowing as they're implementing or thinking about implementing and collecting data on their tutoring programs?
First and foremost, collect the data, right? And we wouldn't have been able to do that without your assistance. And it was extremely helpful for us because it told us a story that we didn't see or would not have seen had it not been for the way in which we collected it, and we were able to have those conversations with you. So I think that's really important. The other piece is to make sure that the tutors are aware of the surveys and those expectations are very clear. We had a couple of instances where some tutors filled it out, some forgot to send it out to the kids, and that was a struggle that we had to deal with because obviously you're looking for information to improve your practice or your programs. And if you don't have that information and they forget to gather that information, then it isn't helpful at all, and your program won't move or make the progress it needs to. And obviously, continuous improvement, like that double loop learning is key. You send those surveys out frequently. Make sure that your students are filling them out. Make sure you're getting that feedback to the tutors as well.
Yeah, that's great. And then another thing that we also noticed with you, Susan, and your other colleagues for implementing these programs is then letting the students and the tutors know that you are listening to them. You're not just asking for their feedback, but you're actually listening to them and then utilizing the data to make some improvements. I think obviously the students saw that, and the tutors probably did notice that as well. But I know that you and your colleague were both very vocal about letting them know that we are actually using this data that you're giving to us. That's great. Okay, I have one more question, just any general advice that you have to share with others, not necessarily about data collection, but just about implementing tutoring programs in elementary, middle, or high school that you've had from your experience that you want to share?
Yeah, I already spoke about the small sessions. I think that regardless of the design of your program, the small class size is critical. And remember, when thinking about that size, how important it is for those relationships to develop, and so that was another critical piece. And that doesn't mean the relationship between the tutor and the student. It also means the relationship between the building administrator and the student. When you're selecting students for these programs, you need to meet frequently with them. They need to know that you care. They need to know that they're just not being put into this program because it's a punishment for something they did wrong. I had a lot of those conversations, and they were very important and helpful to the success of the program. Selecting a curriculum was key. We all speak about curriculum and how it matters. I think that the students gave us a lot of feedback on the curriculum we selected, and that helped us to think hard about what types of programs we were going to use for the other sessions we were planning. So make sure you have a vetted curriculum, one that is engaging for the students. And identify obstacles early. There are many obstacles. For example, one of our programs was in the evening for our 8th graders because we knew after school students played a lot of sports, and we didn't want them to have to worry about those sports or picking and choosing, tutoring over an extracurricular activity we knew they loved. So we offered a distance learning option from 6 to 7 o'clock at night, and that was very successful in the spring of last year as well. So identify those obstacles, know your students well, and obviously look at the data because, again, it does tell you a story.
That's wonderful. Thank you, Susan. Those are all really great insights. And I think for those of you who were taking the poll at the beginning of our webinar that were saying that you haven't yet implemented a program, hopefully that insight was really helpful for you. And for those of you who are already implementing these programs, hopefully that's helpful for you as well. So we do have time now for some questions for Susan as well as for Christina. So if you have any questions, please post them in the chat and we will answer them in the order that we receive them. And while we are waiting for those, we do have several questions that folks posted when they registered, so we can answer some of those questions as well. But it looks like we have our first question from Elizabeth. Thank you for posting. Susan, do you have an idea about what portion of students chose the evening distance learning option?
I did. So it was the only option. So it wasn't a choice. For that first group of students, that was the only option that we offered, and we chose that option because when we spoke with students and said, what do you think of this program, the feedback we received was, especially at the middle school, how am I going to get there? Who's going to take me back to school? So that was the only option when we started that program. And again, we found it to be very successful because it worked with the group of students who we were putting into that program at that time.
That's great. And for those of you who aren't familiar with Tiverton, it's a slightly rural area, and so transportation by public transportation isn't necessarily an option for many folks. So transportation was an issue, and having virtual seemed to be really helpful for you. So let me pose another question while we wait for some more live questions. This might be one that Christina or Sue would like to answer, and I'm wondering, who do you feel like is best positioned to provide these high-dosage tutoring services, and how does this fit into a workload if that person is a teacher? Maybe Susan and then Christina?
Sure. When we thought about these programs, we knew teacher burnout would be an issue. Obviously, we had our teachers last year working really hard, providing distance learning instruction and in-person instruction at the same time. I think that having trained education professionals is a critical component of these programs. Those who knew the curriculum, very helpful when we were running these types of programs. And when we couldn't get our teachers to run these programs, we did post on schoolspring.com to get teachers to be interested in being a tutor for our district, but we also were pretty hard when we choose to employ them because we wanted to be selective and make sure they had the background experience needed to perform the duties that we wanted them to perform.
And this actually relates to another question that was posed about recruiting and retention of tutors. You spoke about burnout this last year. We all know that it was an incredibly hard year, especially for teachers. And so can you spoke a little bit more about the recruiting and then the retention of your tutors?
Sure. Some of it was recruiting, some of it was calling, the teachers into my office and saying, I really need your help in doing this. And many of the teachers came back. But are you referring to the students or are you referring to the teachers?
Actually, great clarification question. Could you actually speak to both of those? Because I think both would be really interesting to hear about.
Sure. As I said, I started with the teachers and, self-selected. And because I knew some teachers would be better with certain groups of students. And I also didn't want students working with teachers that they had during the school year, especially if there were personality conflicts. I did look at that as well. And then in retaining tutors, I think the experience was beneficial for them. And their resistance at first was they were worried about being tired or not being effective, but then when they saw the results, they came back and they wanted to do the job and they wanted to do it well. So that was a little bit easier after their first tutoring sessions. As far as the students are concerned, we looked at a lot of different things when selected them. I can speak about middle school first. For students in grade 4 coming to grade 5, we did look at data as well. We looked at STAR data. We identified students who were just on that cusp of being proficient in areas of reading and mathematics, and those were our students. We did not put students in the program who had IEPs. At that time, we worked hard to speak with families about what their needs were, and then at the high school level, it was about those students who were in danger of failing or not graduating on time. And getting other students to join the program is easy once you have success because students listen to their friends and they say it's a great program and they want to be in it as well. So that's the retention piece for students.
Right. Great. So I'm wondering if maybe we could have Christina speak to some of the questions that were posed earlier. And just if you noticed that our technical producer put in a feedback survey that we would love for you to fill out before the end of the webinar, and we'll also email it out to you after. So, Christina, I'm wondering if you could speak to the question about whether this has been studied in higher education settings. I'm not sure if the research has studied it there, but do you have any thoughts on that?
Thanks, Jess. I don't think that has been as well documented as it has in the K-12 setting, just because it's so much different than everything that we see in the K-12 setting. I'm happy to look up some research and send that out after this webinar if people are interested. Mainly what people talk about in this year in terms of higher ed is using higher ed students to be the tutors, which actually has been proven to have mutual benefits for the tutors in terms of learning how to communicate complex topics and how to form relationships and things like that. So I can certainly find more research on that. I was actually just looking in this list of questions, and there's one on culturally specific tutors, which I'm happy to speak to, Jess, if that's where we want to go.
Sure, Christina.
Okay.
And also feel free to put your email in the chat if people wanted to reach out to you to connect with you directly about more of the research.
Great. Okay. We have talked a lot about culturally specific tutors and how to integrate this into the planning and design of tutoring programs across the districts that we work with. We know that cultural inclusivity is foundational to effective tutoring. We know that it connects students' cultures, their languages, their life experiences with what they learn in tutoring, which then helps them access the rigorous curriculum and even develop those higher level academic skills. This has been documented extensively in the research on teacher effectiveness and just classroom effectiveness, and definitely applies to tutoring as well. We know that becoming a culturally relevant tutor requires an ongoing commitment to things like revisiting and reworking instructional practices and regularly evaluating your own biases. I am reminded that there is a checklist for becoming or working to become a culturally relevant tutor on the National Student Support Accelerator website, because it is such an important part of having effective tutors. So I will also add that into the chat. But the short answer is that it is extremely important, and that is something that should be emphasized in all steps of the way to get to this point where we have tutors that are not only knowledgeable about the content and how to deliver the content, but also about the lives and experiences of their students and can connect to their students so that they can then connect to the content and the relationship piece.
Thank you, Christina. That's really helpful. And feel free to, I know there's some of your colleagues from the Accelerator on the line, so feel free to plug that work and put it into the chat if you want to share that and those resources. That's great too. Thank you. There you go. The next question that I saw in the registration list of questions is about whether you're partnering with any tutoring organizations for your after-school or summer programs. And Sue, I was wondering if you could speak to that.
Absolutely. We were very lucky in that we partnered with the CORE organization. CORE organization is a community-based organization that focuses on social emotional learning through the arts, obviously. So at the beginning of the 5th grade sessions, they begin at 9 a.m. in the morning, and then from 8 to 9, we had the CORE organization come in and just build a self-awareness with the students, and they were able to really develop strong relationships with them and focus on bullying issues, being kind, being aware. And the tutor for those sessions was in that room at all times working with the children as well, and that definitely helped build relationships. Kids wanted to come to school. You look at the data, they were excited. They loved that component of the program. So look for those opportunities to partner with local community organizations to strengthen your program, because that is also very effective.
That's great to hear. So my next question is actually about finances and budgets for this kind of work. And I'm wondering, for those districts and schools who are curious, maybe hesitant, how do I fund this? You know, they might be hesitant to implement a program like this or start. It seems like it's a lot of effort. Can you speak to that, Susan, and how you might get creative about implementing a high-quality, high-dosage tutoring program that doesn't break the bank?
Again, you got to look for those opportunities for grant funding. Obviously, we all received ESSER funding, stimulus money, to improve our programs, and that is money well spent. I didn't have a chance to talk about our high school program and how we had 6 students who weren't going to graduate because of that program graduate on time and with their class. So spend the money, invest in the programs. You look for those community engagement opportunities and look for grant opportunities as well.
Wonderful. And if there's any last questions, please put them in the chat. I'll ask one more while we are waiting. And there's a question here that was posed, and it's a really tricky question. It's about what are some strategies to get students caught up with their classmates, whether it's remediation and acceleration methods or re-engage the disconnected. And I know that, at least in Rhode Island, there's a really big focus on accelerating learning, not remediation. And I think that that's been echoed in lots of other places across the country. And so, Sue, I'll ask you to go first, and Christina, if you have thoughts to share, please do.
Right. We want to seize opportunities for students to feel confident and feel as though they're able to compete with their peers in a classroom. And these programs do just that, right? They give them a little bit of a morale boost so that we, in small group settings, they're comfortable with asking questions, comfortable with, being able to participate in a class, and you can really identify the issues that students are having as far as their learning of the core content in the area of reading and mathematics as well. Christina, do you have anything to add?
I think that you said it great, Sue. I would just say that we've seen a ton of research on the acceleration versus remediation question. And I think reasonable people can disagree. What I've heard in the early grades, like with reading, remediation can be something that to focus on, but generally acceleration is the way to go in that, you are pulling in relevant content from what the student is learning day to day, and then scaffolding in some remedial skills that will allow the student to access the content. And that looks different by grade and by subject and by context, but that is the general rule that we are trying to apply across the curricula with the districts that we are working with in Rhode Island.
Yeah, I agree completely. You definitely want them to have success, and you want them to feel as though they're on par with their peers, and it's not a punishment, as I said.
Exactly.
Thank you both so much. Your insight is really helpful. And again, thanks, Sue, for the opportunity to work with you and for being here today. I'm going to now transition us into the next piece where we're just wrapping up. And you've gotten a few prompts now to take our survey. It really does help us improve the work. We want to know about how you found this webinar today. So please take the survey as you close, you'll be prompted to as we close out the webinar, and you'll also receive an email about it as well. Our email addresses are here in the chat, and we have Christina's from, oops, I'm sorry, I put the wrong one in there. Christina, I know that you've put yours in there. It's brown.edu, not edc.org. Sorry about that. Our website for the REL is also in there as well. There was a quick question. If Sue, it looks like you're answering that in the chat. Thank you. We have references, and that's about it. Thank you so much. We really appreciate you joining today. And please feel free to reach out to us if you have any additional questions. And take care.